Good evening again, and welcome to the first meeting of the Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel. This panel was created pursuant to Section 14 of Chapter 188 of the Acts of 2016 to serve as a conduit for public information in matters related to the decommissioning of the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station. My name is Angela O'Connor, and under the terms of Section 14, I am the acting chair of the panel until it elects a chair. The panel will be formally taking up that election of the chair at a later date. Before we begin, I would like to thank Plymouth South High School for making these wonderful facilities available for us tonight and for all of their help in setting this up. I would also like to thank the members of the public that have taken the time to join us here this evening. This is a topic that is certainly very important to this panel, and it is plainly a topic that is of great consequence to the community, and we look forward to the opportunity to hear from you directly. We have set aside some time tonight for that purpose, and when we reach that time on the agenda, I will read off the names of those that have signed up to speak and ask them to come up one at a time. We will try to accommodate as many people as we can, but we may not get to everyone as we only have the facilities for a limited period of time this evening. To that end, please also be mindful of those wishing to speak behind you in the line and try to limit your points to avoid unnecessary redundancy. This is just the first of many public meetings, and I anticipate the panel will provide plenty of opportunities for your voice to be heard. I also want to note that we have public access television here this evening, so I would ask that both members of the panel and the public speak loud and clear when recognized in addressing the panel. I think at the outset it makes sense for me to briefly review the duties of this panel, which were set forth in the Energy Diversity Act. The Act states, "The panel shall serve in an advisory capacity only and shall not have the authority to direct decommissioning of Pilgrim." The specific duties of the panel are as follows: to commence public meetings beginning on or about June 1st, 2017, at a frequency of quarterly until the shutdown of Pilgrim for the purpose of discussing issues related to decommissioning planning activities. To hold a minimum of 4 public meetings each year for the purpose of discussing issues relating to the progress of decommissioning of Pilgrim beginning on or about June 1st, 2019, or when Pilgrim permanently ceases power operations. To advise the governor, the general court, the agencies of the Commonwealth, and the public on issues related to the decommissioning of Pilgrim with a written report being developed annually. To serve as a conduit for public information and education on and to encourage community involvement in matters related to the decommissioning of Pilgrim, and to receive written reports and presentations on the decommissioning of the station at its regular meetings. To periodically receive reports on the Decommissioning Trust Fund and other funds associated with the decommissioning of Pilgrim, including fund balances, expenditures made, and reimbursements received. To receive reports regarding the decommissioning plans for Pilgrim, including any site assessments, post-shutdown decommissioning assessment reports, provide a forum for receiving public comment on these plans and reports, and to provide comments on these plans and reports as the panel may consider appropriate to state agencies and owners of Pilgrim and in the annual report. As you can see, we have a very diverse panel with a wide range of backgrounds, perspectives, and experiences. I think that diversity will serve us all very well. In particular, I think having MEMA, the Massachusetts Emergency Management, on the panel will be a huge asset, as it has a 16-member nuclear preparedness division that is funded through an annual assessment from Entergy. MEMA's nuclear division works on planning, training, and exercises to support emergency response. I think MEMA's knowledge base and expertise will be extremely valuable to this panel. We may want to consider setting up a website for this panel that is hosted on MEMA's website, but we can discuss that more at a later time. At this point, I would like to go around and have each member of the panel briefly introduce themselves, providing their name and their appointing authorities. If you look at the microphone, you'll see a button, and when you turn it on, it turns green. But we can start. You want to start down that end?
And appointed by Entergy and the state.
Sean Mullen, a resident of Plymouth, and I was appointed by the Minority Senate Leader.
Pat Charamallo with the Old Colony Planning Council, and I was appointed by the Old Colony Planning Council.
Hi, John G. Flores. I'm a counselor in the town of Barnstable. I was appointed by Governor Charlie Baker.
Heather Leitner, President of Concerns Neighbors of Pilgrim and former Nuclear Matters Committee member.
David Nichols, I'm a resident of Plymouth and was appointed by Governor Charlie Baker.
John G. Russo, I'm the Planning and Nuclear Section Chief for MEMA. I'm here representing Director Kurt Schwartz, who presently is out of the country.
Good evening. My name is Jack Priest. I'm the Director of the Radiation Control Program for the Department of Public Health.
Pine Dubois, I was appointed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Hi, I'm Mike Gorski from the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. I've been delegated to this position by Secretary Matt Beaton of Energy and Environmental Affairs.
Good evening. I'm Dan Wolf, former state senator for Cape Cod and the Islands, and I was appointed by Senate President Stan Rosenberg.
Mike Toomey, Vice President of External Affairs for Entergy, along with John Orenberger. We are the two nominees to the panel allocated to Pilgrim Nuclear Station.
My name is Rick Sherman. I'm an employee at Pilgrim. I'm appointed by Greg Pinkham from Local 369, Utility Workers Union of America.
Good evening. I'm Richard Grassi, resident of Plymouth. I'm a former member of the Nuclear Matters Committee of the town of Plymouth, and I was appointed by the minority head of the House. I don't know how you say that.
Good evening. Kevin O'Reilly, Plymouth resident and Executive Director of the Plymouth Area Chamber of Commerce, and I was appointed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Joe Coughlin, Plymouth resident. I am a member of the Plymouth Nuclear Matters Committee. I was appointed by the town of Plymouth, and I'm a retiree from the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA in Washington.
Do we have everybody? Awesome. Okay, in order to provide a solid grounding for the panel's work, we have asked Entergy to provide an overview of Pilgrim plant operations and the status of decommissioning planning. At this time, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Entergy to present this information.
We've got Joe Lynch, who is our Senior Manager of Government Affairs Decommissioning, here tonight, and he'll make the presentation.
Not sure where the best place is to do the presentation, but in a second or so we'll have the slides up. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Joe Lynch. As Mike mentioned, I'm the Government Affairs Manager for Pilgrim Station. A little bit about my background, 35 years in the nuclear industry. I've spent the last 10 years with Entergy. The 25 years prior to that I was with Yankee Atomic Electric Company. I've got quite an extensive experience in decommissioning. I was involved with the Yankee Row Nuclear Power Station in Western Massachusetts, the other decommissioned site. Worked along with Mr. Gorski on that project. Connecticut Yankee, Maine Yankee, and Vermont Yankee most recently, so Pilgrim will be the 5th site that I've been involved with the decommissioning aspects. Next slide, please. And next, and next. Thanks. I'll start off with a brief overview of the plant status, just to kind of put everybody in perspective of where we stand with the site. Pilgrim Station began its 21st and final refueling outage 21, back on April 9th of 2017. Earlier this week, the site synchronized back onto the grid on Monday the 22nd after upgrading, replacing, inspecting hundreds of pieces of equipment as we normally do during our refueling outage, as well as changing out the fuel for the last 24-month cycle. During this refueling outage, Entergy invested over $54 million in equipment and salaries and inspection activities during the RFO. In order to do that, we had to supplement our staff of about 620 full-time employees with about 800 temporary employees, these individuals skilled in various areas to support the refueling. As many of you know, we've been operating safely for more than 40 years, and with the work that we completed during this refueling outage, that will ensure that the plant will continue to operate safely through our planned shutdown date of no later than June 1st, 2019. As far as a regulatory update, certainly there's been a lot recently having to do with our regulatory performance. During the last several months, we've been going through a very major NRC inspection known as a Inspection Procedure 95003. We completed the on-site activities of that particular inspection back in January. We received our annual assessment letter from the NRC on March 3rd. Concluding that our overall performance preserved public health and safety. On March 21st, the NRC held a public meeting both to provide an overview of our annual assessment as well as to exit from the 95003 inspection. Most recently, on May 10th, the NRC did issue their final inspection report, which outlined the findings and observations that the team of 20 NRC inspectors observed during the 3 weeks of on-site time and the many weeks back in headquarters and at their offices, and they did conclude that our programs and processes at the site adequately support nuclear safety. However, our performance remains and should remain in column 4 performance. The next major milestone will be the issuance of what is known as a confirmatory action letter, or CAL. We expect that in the early part of the summer, in the next several weeks. The confirmatory action letter will describe in words and in actions what are the necessary steps on the part of the station to complete the activities that were identified either during our performance or during the inspection that the NRC did at their 95003. And the time frame for that, with the completion of those activities, we would be able to exit from column 4 performance. So we look forward to that. We'll integrate that into our overall recovery plan and then take the necessary steps to continue to improve plant performance going forward. In April, we also received an important ruling. The Massachusetts Lands Court heard a case that challenged the zoning permit for the dry cast fuel storage pad that we have constructed and now houses 8 of the dry casts on site. There was a challenge that we should have gone through a special permitting process for that, and the court agreed that we had gone through the proper zoning and permitting with the town of Plymouth, so that activity is now complete. Additional regulatory update, we are working with the NRC right now by submitting requests to change both our operating license and seek permission for certain activities that are going to be necessary as we transition into decommissioning. We just received approval from the NRC for some administrative changes to our technical specification, which is our operating license, and we also received approval for our certified fuel handler program. So our operators who will be operating the plant for the next 2 years will transition into a role as certified fuel handlers. That had to be approved by the NRC, and we received that. We'll be submitting additional requests for approval to the NRC as we transition towards decommissioning, including changes to our emergency plan. And I'll be able to report on that in the future. Now I'd like to transition to talk a little bit about our decommissioning planning, really what you're here to hear tonight. The first step in transitioning from an operating plant to a decommissioning plant is to have a very robust plan to meet all of the NRC expectations and requirements. And in order to do that, we will be forming a dedicated decommissioning planning organization under the direction of John Orenberger, our new decommissioning director at the site. That team will have a number of employees and industry experts that will start to develop some of the key submittals. They'll be looking at the operating history of the plant to determine if there's any events or any significant activities that would be worthy of including into our decommissioning plan, including any historic spills or events which we've been keeping track of since we've been operating the plant. They will be separate from the group that will be operating the plant safely, and their focus will be to, again, come up with these milestones. The other thing that we're going to do is to generate a specific decommissioning website that will be created and maintained. It'll include a library of all of our key submittals, communications, including presentations like this, and any updated information that we have on the decommissioning process. So currently, you could go on to the Pilgrim's normal website, and we have a tab that is focused on decommissioning. But because there will be a lot of documentation, a lot of information that will be very important to the public in this panel, we'll be creating that separate decommissioning website. So a few of the major activities will include the development of some key submittals to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Those are the post-shutdown decommissioning activities report, or as the acronym is the PSDAR. I'll describe what's included in that. We'll have a very detailed site-specific decommissioning cost estimate that will be based on the current state of the site as well as the operating history. And we'll also develop a plan that will talk about what we're going to do with the spent fuel pool and all the fuel that's stored on site as it gets transitioned to dry cast fuel storage. So those will all be developed over the next 2 years. The PSDAR is due to be submitted to the NRC within 2 years after you shut down. There's nothing that precludes you sending that in earlier, since we have essentially 2 years to plan for decommissioning. It's expected that we'll have that submittal developed in advance of the shutdown or near the shutdown. Once we've permanently ceased power operations, we'll take the fuel that's in the reactor, we'll move that to the spent fuel pool, and then we will certify to the NRC that we've both ceased power operations and that we are permanently defueled. So that'll occur a short time after we shut down in 2019. We will then transition inspection programs. We will still very much have NRC oversight of our activities. I would expect for the first 6 months after we shut down, it would be near normal NRC oversight, and then we would transition into what is known as the decommissioning inspection program. The NRC would, at that point, reduce their on-site presence, but not the activities of overseeing the actions at the site. As we make our plan and develop our plan for decommissioning, we have essentially 3 choices that we would have to strategize and determine what is the best strategy for this site. You'll find on the NRC website, they're defined as decon, safe store, and entomb. I'll go right to the last one. Entomb is a choice that nobody has ever selected. Essentially, what you would do is structurally encase the site in concrete and leave it for a long period of time. That is not an option that we will be choosing or has anybody. So we will be looking at either decon, which is essentially immediate transition to radiological decommissioning of the plant, or safe store, which is a deferred dismantling. That allows us up to 60 years to ensure, one, we have the proper funding and the plans for decommissioning, and at such time we have the amount of money that's necessary for both the physical decommissioning, the oversight of the spent fuel, and site restoration. We would then be able to start with the decommissioning process. At this point, we have not selected which methodology we're going to use. It will be, again, informed on the overall cost and strategy that we have yet to develop. I've included in your slide package a couple of graphics. This one came from Vermont Yankee. Many of you are aware Vermont Yankee shut down at the end of 2014, a sister plant, also owned by Entergy. So we've been in the decommissioning process for that plant for about 2.5 years now. And early on, we developed this graphic to give folks an idea of what the transition would look like for our plant staff. So while the numbers might be different for Pilgrim, and we don't know exactly the time frames as yet, what it shows is that while we're operating, we'll continue to have adequate staffing to safely operate the plant. In the case of Vermont Yankee, that was roughly 550, 600 people. In parallel, we'll have this decommissioning planning organization that I described earlier. Once we have shut the plant down, we will reduce our staff by about 50%. In the case of Vermont Yankee, we transitioned to about 316 people. The majority of those people, and the reason that we had to maintain that staff, was because we still have obligations under our emergency plan. And as long as we have fuel on the site, fuel in the spent fuel pool, fuel on the ISFA pad, we need to have an emergency plan that is coincident with the risks associated with that. That period of time is about anywhere between 15 and 18 months. Each calculation for the amount of time that we have to remain in what we call a safe store 1 period is plant specific, so we'll have to do that analysis for Pilgrim. But during that period of time, the fuel is allowed to cool in the spent fuel pool, and the risks of certain events become less and less, and it allows us to transition to yet a different emergency plan, and we can further reduce our staffing. In the case of Vermont Yankee, we did that roughly 14 months later, and we went from about 316 to about 127 personnel. And that period of time is the period from when fuel will remain in the pool until it's fully transitioned to dry fuel storage. So in the case of Vermont, we're going through that right now. That 127 plus or minus people also include our security force. Our security force will still remain 24/7. They will be there to oversee and protect the fuel, and they are included as part of our overall staffing organization. And then finally, when the fuel is transferred from wet to dry and all the fuels on the pad, we would then go into a dry fuel management program. Again, a lesser requirement for our emergency plan, and we'll be down to about 58 to 60 people, and again, that would include both a security force and then an organization overseeing activities at the site. I've developed kind of a draft timeline for Pilgrim that kind of emulates what was happening in Vermont. These dates are not specific because, again, we haven't developed a plan, but we made our announcement and our intention to cease operations back in October of 2015. In November of that year, we did submit notification to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that we did intend to cease operations. That's a necessary step as part of their regulations. We have our projected shutdown date of June 1st, 2019. That would follow with the removal of fuel from the reactor and store that into the spent fuel pool. Very short time after that, we'll transition to what is known as our post-shutdown emergency plan. That will trigger that first staff reduction. We'll then go into that safe store period of anywhere from 12, 14, 16 months. We'll then go into a new emergency plan. That's called permanently defueled emergency plan, another staff reduction, a period of time for transitioning the fuel from wet to dry, and then finally we would go into an ISFA only emergency plan, which all of these dates, again, are being projected based on what we know now. There are technologies out there that are constantly changing and being able to accelerate some of these things. We'll obviously take advantage of those, but again, until we develop that detailed plan, I wanted to give everyone kind of a visual of where we expect to be at this point in our decommissioning planning. So talk specifically about some of the requirements and submittals that we have. The first one I had mentioned is the post-shutdown decommissioning activities report. It is governed by NRC guidance documents and regulations. Part 10, which is the energy part of the Code of Federal Regulations, under Part 50 has regulations on what is necessary to go into a PSDAR. There's also some guidance documents from the NRC that will determine some of the content that we have. These PSDAR submittals are based in a lot of part on what has been done by other sites. So while we'll have some very specific Pilgrim information, we'll also use the latest lessons learned from the industry. The people assembling it will be part of John Orenberger's team at the site, as well as an organization that specializes in putting together the cost estimate and some of the other elements. It will rely heavily on the knowledge of the people at the site who have been working there for many years to guide us in how we're going to go about putting together the plan. It'll include a description of planned decommissioning activities. It'll have a very detailed schedule. That, at that point, we'll determine whether we're going to go into a decon or immediate decommissioning or safe store. It'll include our detailed decommissioning cost estimate, and it'll discuss environmental impacts. The PSDR is a living document. This is not a one-time document. In the event that we have any major changes to our decommissioning plans, we're obligated to update it with the NRC. It's also an open and public process. Once we issue the PSDAR and it's been accepted by the NRC, there'll be a 90-day public comment period. During that 90-day public comment period, the NRC will hold a public meeting local to the site, likely here in town, and they'll receive comments from the public on the PSDAR. They'll then take that all back. They'll review the PSDAR. They don't have a formal approval process, but there will be an interchange back and forth between us and them in regards to questions they might have on our submittal, and as well, they'll address comments from the public during that period of time. The other plan that we developed is known as the Spent Fuel or Radiated Fuel Management Plan. Again, NRC guidance documents are out there for exactly what needs to go into it. So this will be a written notification to the NRC discussing changes to how we're going to manage fuel going forward. We're going to also have to talk about how the transition of fuel from wet to dry will be funded, where that money will come from, and ultimately, what are our plans for designing a system so that ultimately when the fuel is taken away by the Department of Energy, when they meet their contractual obligations, we have the fuel readied for that time. So we'll develop all of that with the best available information. As mentioned, we have right now one ISFSI or dry fuel storage pad constructed. It's loaded with 8 casks. Each of those casks have 68 fuel assemblies, so we have 544 in dry storage right now. It's anticipated that once we offload all the fuel from the core into the spent fuel pool, we'll need a total of about 62 casks, and we'll make that final determination as part of this irradiated fuel management plan. Lastly, we'll be developing this detailed decommissioning cost estimate. Again, there's NRC regulations that guide that. We'll likely be using an organization called TLG Services. They're essentially the industry benchmark for doing this type of work. They've actually been doing general decommissioning cost estimates for us all along. They'll then get into one that is very specific to what it's going to take to transition the plant from operating through license termination. That's terminating our license with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They'll also estimate the cost of maintaining the spent fuel on the site, and then finally the cost of restoring the site to both state and federal regulations. Along with that, there'll be a certain set of assumptions that will have to be developed, as again, we will be kind of projecting where we're going to go into the future. And then finally, we'll kind of put together that overall schedule for when we expect to accomplish decommissioning. Just an update on the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund. Right now, or at the end of March 31st, the latest report out on our trust fund is that we have just about $1 billion in the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund. As far as our commitment to open and transparent communications going forward, obviously we'll look forward to opportunities to speak before this panel quarterly as the meetings are held. We'll be giving updates on where we stand with the decommissioning plan as it evolves and any of the issues affecting the plant. We'll also continue to conduct outreach to the community. There's a number of groups that have already been formed through the Plymouth Board of Selectmen and other community groups that have asked for our outreach. We'll do that locally to all the towns surrounding the plant, as well as the Cape, where I'm a resident, and look forward to meeting some of the folks on the Cape to give them an update on the opportunities to learn more about decommissioning, ask questions about our process going forward. We have been a huge contributor to the community over the years, and we will continue to do so for as long as we can, given that we're going to be shutting the plant down in a couple of years, but our commitment to the community is obviously very, very important to us. We'll also work with the local media, providing them with information, updates on decommissioning as major milestones are reached, and hopefully they will be in a position to ask us questions about what we're doing and guide them through that process as well. In certain occasions, we have the ability to bring people on site, and we will welcome key stakeholders to the site while we're operating, and certainly as we transition to decommissioning, to give them a firsthand look on what's going on at Pilgrim Station. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, we will be developing a plant-specific decommissioning website where we'll have all that information. We'll also be reaching out through digital media, social media, providing updates through kind of the more modern ways of getting information out into the world today. And I'd be more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you. I'd like to start now with some questions from the panel. So which way should we start? Start down on that end if there's any questions? Yeah. And work our way this way.
There's been published reports about the exploratory process that you've been engaged in, perhaps selling and transferring the license to another third party. Could you go into that in some detail now, as understanding that it still may be in the exploratory phase?
Sure. First thing I'll mention is that at Vermont Yankee, which, as I had mentioned earlier, is fairly well along, we are engaged with a group of companies led by a company called North Star, who is interested in purchasing that particular asset for the purpose of doing near-term decommissioning, accelerated decommissioning, and we're hoping to get both Nuclear Regulatory Commission and State of Vermont approval. In the case of Pilgrim, we have been approached by a company called Accelerated Decommissioning Partners. One of the partners is North Star. North Star is the largest decommissioning organization in the world. They've partnered with Areva to form this company that is looking into the possibility, the feasibility of looking at Pilgrim Station as one future project. But as you mentioned, it is very much an exploratory process at this point. As that gets further along, and if it's something that is worthy of more detail, I'll be more than happy to present that at a future meeting.
Yeah, just a couple of quick questions. I know that in your presentation you suggested that for 40 years you have been operating safely. I saw a lot of eyes rolling, and with all of the negative press that has been written about really the overall operation of Pilgrim, almost to the point where it appears as if it's the gang that couldn't shoot straight. How can you guarantee that everything that you have suggested in this document is actually going to happen?
I wasn't planning on going into operational issues this evening. I wanted to give a plan update because I thought that was an important part of transition to decommissioning. I think it's been very widely publicized that the NRC has gone through their process of overseeing our performance and has deemed that it's safe for us to continue to operate. So at this point, our focus will be on safe operation. And again, my preference this evening is to talk more about our transition to decommissioning.
This might be a little specific for tonight, but I was wondering if Entergy had a plan for where the second storage pad was going to be located, and if not, or even if so, would there be any possibility of Entergy working with the community to locate that pad farther from Cape Cod Bay?
We have not made a determination of where the second ISFC pad would be at this point. That's part of the decommissioning planning process. And I think as we kind of mature in that, we'll certainly be, reaching out to make sure that we are listening to the community and our stakeholders.
Joe, a quick question on dry cast. From now until when the plant shuts down, will Entergy continue to have campaigns to put fuel from the spent fuel pool into dry cast storage?
John, I'm not aware of what our plans are for the future, but I know as part of that overall irradiated fuel management plan, we're looking to when we'll do some of the near term and when we'll do kind of the long term. One of the things that we ensure we have is ample space in the spent fuel pool. So the 8 casks that are on the pad right now, loaded with the 544 fuel assemblies, is to ensure that. I'm not aware if we need any additional capacity to run to the end of 2019, but I can do a follow-up, if you will, on that.
I'm just going to ask panel members, if you don't mind, just because we're trying to record accurate minutes here, if you could just identify yourself before you ask the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Jack Priest, Department of Public Health, Radiation Control Program. Joe, I think it might be useful if you could explain the differences, maybe a few major highlights between the reactor oversight process, which is the current NRC oversight program, and then the decommissioning inspection program after the cessation of operations.
Sure, thanks, Jack. The NRC, under the ROP, or the Reactor Oversight Process, looks at about 8 different functional areas. They look at the emergency plan, they look at security, they look at a number of areas that are specific to the operation of the plant. Things like our ability to operate continuously without having events like scrams and things like that. A lot of those will go away once we shut down. So the decommissioning oversight process focuses primarily on those activities associated with the safe storage of the fuel and radiological safety and the emergency plan. So it's a pared down scope based on the fact that the plant is no longer operating.
Good evening. Pine Dubois with the Jones River Watershed Association, Cape Cod Bay Watch, and the town of Kingston in particular. I have some questions about your presentation and then a general couple of requests. So you said that Entergy invested over $54 million on equipment and salaries during the RFO. How much of that was fuel?
I believe that does not include the cost of the fuel.
You also said that Pilgrim is expected to close on June 1st, 2019. Is that a date certain?
That's a no later date. If we operate through this next cycle safely, I believe that it's projected that we would operate until the date that we've put out there.
But there is no discussion in Entergy to try to extend that date in any way?
That's correct. That is a date that we will not exceed.
Okay. Your confirmatory action letter, if it doesn't get you out of column 4, what are you going to do?
Well, the confirmatory action letter is actually issued by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and it will be a letter that outlines, in the eyes of the NRC, based on this most recent 95003 inspection, the important elements that the NRC want us to complete to their satisfaction and to our satisfaction by a certain date. So it'll list a certain requirement, and it'll give us a certain amount of time, 6 months, 9 months, 1 year. When we're complete with those activities, the NRC would come back in and they will evaluate whether we met that criteria. In the event that we've met that criteria, they will then go back and assess whether we have met the standard for transitioning out of column 4 to column 1. It is going to be our focus, and our all resources will to be transitioning out of column 4 and meet all the requirements of the confirmatory action letter while we operate for the next 2 years.
So it's your intention as a company to operate under column 1 until 2019?
We will operate in column 4, and we will do everything we can to transition to column 1 before we cease operations in 2019.
As far as the irradiated spent fuel management plan update and as part of the PSDAR, can I ask that Entergy involve the community in your plans for spent fuel?
The community will have an opportunity to make comments on our submittal during the 90-day.
That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking you to acknowledge that there is considerable concern about the location of your both the wet fuel and ultimately the dry casks that are located within 150 feet of Cape Cod Bay, close to the shore, with no plan to move it anywhere else. I'm asking for a commitment from Entergy to work with the community to get that stuff away from Cape Cod Bay and into a safer location that we can all agree. Not, you know, not that the casks are good when they're in a refinery or something, not that in some desert location the pad would be good, but that the fuel stored on the Cape Cod Ocean Sanctuary will not, will not, I'm talking about the PSDAR, will not jeopardize, you know, the environment and the community. That's what I'm asking. I'm asking for a public involvement commitment.
First, I'd like to assure you that the location of the first pad was constructed in accordance with all proper regulations. It's in a location that is protective of the environment and respective of our location relative to Cape Cod Bay. I would expect the exact same for the second pad.
Well, I would expect the exact same for the second too, and that's what concerns me. So the problem that we have, and the reason why public involvement is so important, is that it's apparent to us, and it's clear to us, that Entergy, like some people in the country, don't recognize that the sea level is rising, or that there are endangered species and threatened species and important resources in Cape Cod Bay next to. And we don't think that you're actually considering that. So what we want to do is be involved with you so that you can understand what our concern is, because it's pretty clear to us that you don't understand what the concern is. Otherwise, I'm certain that Entergy, being the company that it is, and having, you know, helped the communities in the way it does, you know, would respond to that.
Pine, I think that we can all agree that that's an incredibly important question, but I also think it's outside the scope of what this panel has been charged to do by the legislation. I think it's an important discussion, but it is outside the scope of this panel. So if we can get through, you know, try to get through some of the rest of your questions, it would be helpful.
Well, with all due respect, since we have to make a recommendation to the governor, I think that it's within the bounds of our need to help the public, you know, with the questions that the public has and the panel has in terms of going forward. We know what Entergy's goals are. We understand those. It's pretty clear. I'm not even certain what the state's goals are. So I think we have a lot of discussing to do in terms of what the agencies are going to take care of, where we need new laws, and what the public, how the public needs to respond. And but I understand that we're trying to get through this. I just have a couple more questions.
No, and I want to make sure that you have time to ask them as well as the rest of the panel, and there's a lot of people that took time out of their busy schedules here tonight. But I will again refer to my opening comments that what this commission was tasked to do by the legislature. Again, it's not saying that the questions you're asking aren't incredibly important, and the people that are all here feel very passionately about that. We can discuss as a commission what should be included in that report, and perhaps it does include some of those questions. But to sticking to the task that we were appointed to do, I want to make sure we give everybody adequate time to ask their questions.
I can stop now, because it seems like that's the problem.
John Mahoney, Plymouth Board of Selectmen. Joe, just one question. You gave an update on the decommissioning fund, which was around $1 billion. How much does it currently cost to decommission the plant safely? And if you don't have that number right now, how long is it going to take until we know what that figure is?
John, we don't obviously have the more detailed cost estimate for doing the physical decommissioning of the plant. That will be our job over the next 2 years. In the case of Vermont Yankee, we have figures. I would use those as a reference, but you know, in the ballpark of, you know, $1 billion+. So we'll refine that number. We'll put that number out, and that will also make the determination whether we're capable of going into a decon scenario or a safe start scenario, and we'll have a timetable associated with when we project we could start physical decommissioning.
Well, that's exactly what prompted the question, and I remember a year or two ago, the last figures that we had was that the decommissioning fund had about $900 million in it, and it was going to cost us, or you, 1.2 to 1.3 billion to decommission. But so there's no indication yet that that is increased by 100, 200, 300 million dollars. It's just going to take 2 years to get that number.
It'll be developed over the next couple of years, but what we're learning is technology is improving, the methods for decommissioning are getting more efficient. So as you see in the last couple of years, we've grown the fund by 10%. So I feel very confident that starting off at this point, we'll have a figure in the future that once we have the final numbers will reveal itself.
Mike Gorski from Mass DEP. Joe, in Rowe, Yankee Atomic had an expressed objective of leaving a site, a site with unrestricted use. Does Entergy have the same objective for this plant?
We haven't determined the end state, but we will be inspired by all of the Massachusetts state regulations under the beneficial use determination process that we followed in Massachusetts. So we'll have governing state regulations as well as the NRC guiding that process. But we would expect to meet, as a minimum, the NRC 25 milliohm cleanup standard for radiological, and anything that either the Department of Environmental Protection, Department of Public Health, and other federal departments that would have a stake in how we clean the site up. So as you recall, at Yankee Row, we developed a very comprehensive set of regulations. I would imagine we would do the same for this site.
Thank you, Joe. Great presentation. Two questions. First is the decision to go with I'm Dan Wolf. Dan Wolf, former state senator for the Cape and Islands, appointed by the Senate President. Two questions. The decision with whether to do decon or safe store. I'm curious as to what are the weighted criteria that go into that decision. How does that process work? How transparent is it?
Well, we would not go forward with a decon or immediate decommissioning scenario unless we have enough money to ensure that once we start the project, we don't have to stop midway. That would not meet NRC regulations or expectations. So we would compare the amount of money that we have available in the trust to the total cost, and that will inform both the decision whether we go to decon or safe store, and then we would make projections as to what point in the future we could start based on the conservative investment numbers that the NRC allows you to grow your fund 2% on paper, if you will. And once those lines cross, that would be the time in the future.
So just to be clear, there's no risk management, hazard management, safety management system at all involved in that analysis. It's purely a financial analysis?
Well, you'll find as you go into safe store, the longer that the plant remains in that condition, the amount of radiation dose would be reduced. So there is some savings that way. You have to balance that with the cost of waste, so all of that has to be factored into the equation. But you're correct, there are some economies by waiting just due to the fact that the amount of dose in the materials, the concrete, the metal, would decay over that period of time as well. And we balance that in coming up with the decommissioning cost estimate.
Without boring and without getting too far into the weeds, I'd really be curious to see the safety management systems that are going to be running in parallel with the decommissioning. And I'd also be really curious to see whether there is a safety risk analysis as part of the methodology relative to determining which method. Obviously, we can't do that now, but just to sort of, that's an ask. The other question is, in the past couple of years, we've asked and gotten two slightly different answers to the type of dry cask that are being used for storage, whether they are in fact transportable dry cask or whether they are not transportable dry cask as they are being switched to dry cask. And I think that's timely because some of that's happening now.
Sure. We're using what is known as the Holtec 100 system, and that is what is known as an intermodal system. So you can remove the inner container, put it into a transport cask, and then ship it to an ultimate disposal site by either boat, rail, or truck.
But just to be clear, to understand it, they're not being put in a dry cask that's transportable now. What you're saying is they're being put in a dry cask from which they can then be removed and put in a transportable dry cask. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, the overpacks, the large concrete containment vessels that you see on the site are not movable. You would have to remove the inner canister. This is part of the design of the system. It then gets put into a shielded transportation cask. That cask can then be loaded onto some sort of mechanism for transport. These are also envisioned to be consistent with DOE design criteria, but since we don't have an ultimate repository, the designs meet the current NRC regulations, but we don't have to offload the fuel from the inner canisters in order to ship it off-site. And I think ultimately
But
that's
without regard to cost, it would be possible now to be putting these into a more movable, transportable dry cask. Without regard to cost, that is possible, right?
I guess I'm not aware of what other options that would make them any more intermodal than they are right now. There are certainly different ways of storing fuel, all of which can be moved. It's just a matter of whether the system is designed for that, and these are.
Thank you.
Mike Toomey from Entergy. I don't have any specific questions for Joe. I think he did a nice job of making a presentation and answering the questions. This is the opportunity for questions and comments, so I just have one comment, which is, you know, this is a little different type of panel than other state-run panels in that Entergy is participating as a member. We have 3 different individuals who work for Entergy on the panel, and I think we're going to be together for a long time. We're going to have 4 meetings a year. Decommissioning is going to take a long time, and I think it would be constructive if we did not have ad hominem attacks on Entergy and suggestions that it doesn't care about the environment and that it doesn't care about rising sea levels. We've been a national leader in raising that issue as we have our headquarters on the Gulf Coast. So I'm just going to offer a suggestion that if we are going to work together in a transparent and constructive manner, that we not have unnecessary attacks on the company that are not founded. And if we want to have questions and answers about issues, I think that's appropriate. We will participate in full, but I think that's not going to lead to a constructive discussion. And if that is what the objective is, then I think we ought to keep that in mind.
Jessica Casey, former Plymouth resident and former Economic Development Director for the town of Plymouth. Joe, just a question on clarity for the folks on the panel. Can you explain decommissioning and the cost or the estimate of decommissioning and how that breaks out to radiological versus non-radiological, and how the fund needs to cover off one of those pieces? And what I'm thinking of is the impact to the speed of which decommissioning happens, and I just want to be sure that there's clarity there, because I know that was something that we had struggled with in the past.
Sure. So decommissioning is divided into 3 various tasks, if you will. The first is what we call license termination. So that's the physical decontamination of all the structures and then ultimately removal of those structures to meet the NRC license termination criteria. So they've set a criteria for how we have to clean the site up so that it could be dismantled and then eventually be reused. The second element is what is known as site restoration. Site restoration is more focused on non-radiological site restoration, so it would work more closely with the state on meeting those requirements. Those can either be done separately or they can be done at the same time. Once you're finished with the radiological, you determine whether you've met also the non-radiological. Obviously, that's the preferred, more efficient way of doing it. And then the final element is called spent fuel management. So that's the cost of having to have fuel on site on 1 or 2 dry fuel storage pads. The cost of that ultimately can be recovered for the Department of Energy, or at least some majority of it. So because of their failure to have a facility to take the fuel, we unfortunately, like every other licensee, have to go through litigation and sue the DO to recover those costs. So that's what makes up decommissioning, and all of those factor into the schedule and the overall cost of the project.
So when you say that decommissioning estimate is over $1 billion, can you just distinguish in Vermont, for example, what percentage of that $1 billion fell within each of those 3 parts?
Sure. License termination was $817 million. Spent fuel management was $368 million, and site restoration was $57 million.
Great.
Added up to $1.24 billion.
So it's fair to say that the $1 billion in the fund today would cover off that first piece?
That's correct, minus any requirement to have fuel stored on the site, build dry cask fuel storage facilities and maintain them. In the case of Vermont, $1 billion would have covered the license termination physical decommissioning cost.
Great, thank you. And if possible, just a comment, at future meetings, it would be great to be able to see the work that Entergy has done in the community and in the region as far as sponsorships and different community fundraisers and things like that, to be able to get a sense of when the plant does shut down and decommissioning does happen, the loss of jobs, the loss of community involvement that you'll have. I think that that's something that the community and the region needs to think about a lot.
Thank you for that suggestion. I agree completely, and we'll include it in one of our future presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Rich Grassi, Town of Plymouth, the House Minority Leader appointment. I have a question related to your staffing transition to the decommissioning. You use Vermont Yankee as an example. Is it correct that there are 550 personnel at Vermont Yankee versus 620 at Pilgrim?
I think when we were operating Vermont Yankee, we were about 600, and then as we transitioned to shutdown, we did lose a number of our employees to other opportunities. So I believe we had approximately 550 dedicated to the safe operation of the plant. And then we had this other organization which in fact took some of those employees that normally supported safe operation into the planning organization. So we were close to about 600 people when we shut the plant down.
Okay, the follow-on to the follow-on to that is, for Vermont Yankee, you currently have a North Star acquisition proposal that is being considered. And is it for the reactor license only?
It would be for transfer of our operating license and our license to possess and oversee dry fuel. There's two separate licenses.
Okay, so if that's the case, and let's say that's approved or accepted, how would that affect the composition of the personnel that would be in terms of the transition of personnel on the site? How many would be North Star? How many would they all be North Star? Or, for example, here in Plymouth, I'm really looking at the economic impact of the town of Plymouth, where we have 620, and then we'll go down to another number as soon as you get into decommissioning. Does that mean that we're going to now have to accept, if we accept such a plan, new people from North Star, or is North Star going to hire some of the Entergy people that they, do not use in the decommissioning? How do you envision that?
I can't speculate on what's going to happen with Pilgrim because we're in this kind of exploratory process. What I can tell you in Vermont is that one of the elements of our plan in Vermont was first to transition our security force to a privatized security company. So our security force, all of them retain their positions, but they now work for us, an outsourced company, if you will, Securitas. So that will remain the same if there is a transaction approved in Vermont. There will be a small group of people that are currently Vermont Yankee employees that will transition to North Star and become North Star employees if they so desire to accept those positions. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but that's how I envision Vermont based on the information that I have.
Pardon me. Did you say a small number of Entergy employees if North Star takes over the responsibility for the contract?
In accordance with the plan in Vermont, you saw that graphic that I had put up there with the last set of employees down to about 57 employees. That's about 15 VY employees. The balance was security, which is outsourced. So there was only going to be about 15 employees left as we transitioned into this long-term safe store scenario. With the North Star transaction as a possibility, it'll move up and accelerate decommissioning, starting it as early as 2019. I think they're saying around 2021, and they'll have it done no later than 2030. But either way, we would have been down to about 15 plus or minus Vermont Yankee employees. Essentially, we would have just had an organization that would have been overseeing the dry fuel.
Thank you. I have just one very quick question. You mentioned in your presentation that the Entergy would provide a PSDAI, a post-shutdown decommissioning activities report, much sooner than you anticipated. In other words, much sooner than the 2 years after you actually shut the plant down. Is that something that we can depend on, do you think, without putting a date on it?
Yeah, so in Vermont, we submitted our PSDR before we shut down. We submitted our PSDR in late December. We shut down at the end of December. The 2 years that the NRC allows after you shut down, I believe is more there for plants that didn't envision they were going to shut down. Something was forced upon them. So one day they were operating, the next day they had to make the unfortunate decision to shut down. The NRC then gives them 2 years to develop a plan. If you've made that decision in advance, you have the advantage of the planning time, which is what we're going to take advantage of. And I have every confidence there will be a PSDAR developed and submitted coincident with in the same general time frame as our projected shutdown.
That's encouraging, because in order to do our job, I think we need the details of what the decommissioning is going to entail. Tasks, groups, functions, so forth. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Kevin O'Reilly, from Town of Plymouth, resident, Speaker of the House nominee. Thanks for being here, Joe. Just a quick question regarding the exploratory discussions with the accelerated decommissioning services. Does that conversation include what I'll call the land outside the fence? Because there's a concern in Plymouth as to how that will either stay with Entergy or whether it will be disposed of in some other way. I don't know if it's too early to ask that question or not, but it's something we'd be interested in knowing.
Yeah, I'm not aware whether or not that overall exploratory process includes the land, something that we certainly could entertain and discuss. We certainly know the interest in the town, but at this point it's far too early to determine whether that's part of it.
Joe, question on storage of spent fuel. Because of the federal government's lack of enforcement of their own law with regard to taking on the responsibility for providing for the storage, either temporary or permanent, of spent fuel, the licensees around the country have been tasked with having to store it on site. Because of your experience with decommissioning in the areas you mentioned in the past, and your knowledge of the industry in general, there appears to be a move in Washington to change its approach of just providing no help for off-site storage. Whether that picks up steam and turns into something positive will have to follow and remain to be seen. But in that regard, what is your experience with regard to whether it's North Star or other similar kinds of companies in being able to find, if available, temporary storage for spent fuel, and or do they have the experience, once such a capability would be made available, do they have the capability of then transferring or working with whatever other companies may be involved, actually transferring spent fuel from the plant sites to whatever facilities are approved and made available by the federal government?
I guess the way I would answer that is, of course, we'd like to have an ultimate federal final repository for fuel. That would have been Yucca Mountain if it hadn't had its starts and stops. There are also a couple of initiatives right now to look for an interim fuel storage type arrangement. And one of the companies that's involved in the teaming in Vermont is very much involved in that as an option going forward. So I think there is the possibility that there could be something sooner. But as you mentioned, with the the new administration and what they're supporting, it's hard to speculate at this point. But obviously we're following that very closely.
But if it does become available, from your knowledge, does North Star have that ability then to be able to respond?
North Star, with its partner organizations, would have the capabilities of both overseeing the fuel and then eventually addressing its ultimate disposal.
Is the panel all set? Okay, what I would like to do is open it up to members of the public, but I also want to reinforce what Mr. Toomey said. We are going to be spending a great deal of quality time together, both as a panel and with the folks here from the public. So again, I go back to the purpose and the appointment of this commission is to make sure that we are able to get you all the latest, most up-to-date, accurate information about what's happening in this, what is clearly a complicated decommissioning process. And you've got members of different state commissions that are on this, including, I represent the Department of Public Utilities. I'd like to remind people, and I think sometimes this gets lost in translation, but unlike Vermont, and very different than Vermont, Massachusetts is a restructured state. So while we have, the Department of Public Utilities has oversight of our utility companies, our gas and electric companies, and we do a number of other things at the DPU I won't get into, but we don't have any authority, regulatory authority over any power plants, whether they be nuclear, coal, gas, or whatever. So where Vermont was vertically integrated, so the department, the Public Service Board there actually had regulatory authority over power plants. I think that's an important distinction that I'd like to make, but you also have on this panel a great deal of expertise, both at MEMA, as I originally outlined, with nuclear expertise, and Jack Priest on the other side of me has a tremendous amount of expertise around radiation as the head of the radiation control, and DEP is here, and all of us take our role in these state agencies extremely seriously. So I want to, before we open it up, and we'll start with the list that I have, just remind people that we're just here to help facilitate that information and answer questions that you have regarding the decommissioning process. So I want to start with, and if I butcher your name, I apologize in advance, Mary Conathan? There's a question mark, so I don't know if she wants to speak. Okay. No, thank you. Okay. Elaine Dickinson? And again, if I can remind you just to keep your, there's a number of people that have asked to speak, to keep your comments to a couple of minutes. I think the microphone on the stand works. I don't.
Okay, my name is Elaine Dickinson, and I'm here representing the Cape Downwinders. We look forward to working with the NDCAP. Special thank you to Dan Wolf, Pine Dubois, Heather Leitner, and John Flores for their part in this commission to protect the public. Certainly public safety is our shared concern. While we understand neither the NRC nor Entergy consider the dangerous spent fuel pool and serious implications for public safety due to Boraflex panel degradation as a topic for decommissioning, we know that public safety in any discussion is a primary goal for this panel. Cape Codders and all 14 towns voted for the fuel to be moved as soon as possible, and we ask that you consider this a top priority. A question about staffing and any temporary employees. How will they be vetted? How will they be trained, and by whom? Would Homeland Security be involved? I'm just remembering how the Flight Safety Academy in Florida trained the pilots who actually flew into the Twin Towers. Thank you for your service to our communities.
Thank you. Susan Carpenter?
My name is Susan Carpenter. I'm also a member of Cape Down. I'm also a member of Cape Downwinders, and I have a question talking about the cost of decommissioning. I'm wondering if the estimate includes the many waivers that Entergy has applied for using decommissioning funds for other purposes.
We got a report on what's available in the fund, so I don't know if there's general knowledge of waivers or costs associated with that.
I'm not sure of the scope of the waiver question, but I will say this, Mike Toomey on behalf of Entergy. The decommissioning trust fund can be used for a number of purposes without any further request to the NRC. But there are some categories of costs for which it cannot be used without express approval from the NRC. Joe, I think, did a nice job of explaining the general three categories of expenses. Spent fuel management is an example of a cost item that the Decommissioning Trust Fund can be used for if you receive express approval from the NRC to do so. The technical term is a commingled funds exemption, and essentially you request the authority from the NRC to utilize a portion of the Decommissioning Trust Fund for spent fuel management activities because you believe there is sufficient money in the fund to deal with the license termination activities. And those requests are routinely requested. They are frequently granted depending on the circumstances presented in each application. We've obviously not submitted any kind of request with respect to Pilgrim at this point because the plant is still operating.
Thank you, Mr. Toomey. Marion Sullivan? No? Okay. Arthur Dickinson? Carol Coughlin? I'm sorry if I butchered your name. Carol. Does that look like Coughlin? Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. Susan Grassi? Okay. Frank Mand? Okay. I'm just reading names. Joyce McMahon, I'm guessing you're no. Okay, sorry. Margaret Rice Warren?
I'll be a yes.
No, I see that.
I do have some comments, but the handheld? I do have some comments, but I would like to respond to Mr. Toomey's, what I thought was quite a churlish remark. I am not on this panel, and I think that we here have every right and we have an obligation to talk about what we have seen and how we have been treated in the process of the running of the Entergy nuclear power plant. And it is not a personal thing, but I object to being told that I don't have the right to speak about that. This is our property and our lives and our children's lives that are at stake. And if you don't like the way I say it, I'm sorry. I don't like the way the plant has been run. Just want to get that out of my system. Many people all over Massachusetts, and particularly on and around Cape Cod, have been speaking against the Pilgrim plant for many years. The plant has fulfilled every fear and danger predicted over all these years. The NRC has been useless, responding to people's criticisms with platitudes and cynicism. The Entergy Corporation has been encouraged to run roughshod over the many citizens who stand to lose a great deal, indeed everything, should another event occur. We have fought this abomination in many ways: creative, traditional, legal, and even illegal in the form of civil disobedience, on behalf of the health and safety of the Commonwealth and all her natural beauty, and to no avail. Now we have a decommissioning panel, which, by the way, also had to be fought for. I know there are two persons of great courage, intelligence, and integrity sitting on this panel, but I don't know the rest of you. So I ask, who are you here for? The corporation? The weak and emasculated NRC? The governor? Or the citizens of this great Commonwealth? Please consider the question, who are you here for? I hope, I pray that the decommissioning of the Pilgrim plant will be conducted with a greater eye towards safety, scientific data, and respect for the world that holds us so tenderly than ever the poorly functioning Pilgrim plant ever was run. Thank you.
Mary Lambert? Mary Lambert?
Yes. Mary Lambert, speaking for the Town of Duxbury Nuclear Advisory Committee, which requests that the DCAP work on the following issues to better protect our citizens, the region, and the Commonwealth. Regarding spent fuel, to advise and do what you can to get the dry casts to higher ground to prevent for flooding, and put in place mitigation measures for security. Also advise that extra overpacks be on site in case there's a crack in the cast. As far as site restoration, we encourage the state to establish, which it has the authority to do, a cleanup standard that is more conservative than the federal government, a cleanup standard that is in keeping with the National Academy's Beer 7 report, that is consistent with DEP's risk bases for chemicals, and last, a standard that focuses on the most vulnerable of the population, that being babies, babies in utero, and women. We'll also determine that if the site is to be for restricted use, that the standard for unrestricted use apply, because we know that any radionuclides or chemicals will wind up, radionuclides in that case, in the bay and off-site. Further, we would like you to advise that the state prohibits rubblization, and I can give you all the reasons for that to save time. For public safety, we clearly would like to retain the current off-site emergency planning funded by the licensee until the spent fuel is emptied. We advise the committee to support House Bill 1147, which is currently before the Massachusetts State Legislature and would require off-site emergency planning until the pool is emptied and prohibit the use of the Decommissioning Trust Fund for that purpose. We also would like Mass Department of Public Health to be able to continue and expand off-site radiological monitoring and on-site monitoring of tritium and other radionuclides, again, funded by Entergy. Therefore, we advise that this group supports House Bill 1133 that would accomplish this, that is currently before the state legislature. We also would like, as far as finances are concerned, to assure that taxpayers aren't stuck with a bill if money runs short. We would advise then that this group ask the governor and themselves to support Senate Bill 1837 put forward by Senator DiMacedo and supported by Representative Moratori, representing Plymouth and here tonight, which would require a fee paid by Entergy into a special decommissioning trust fund in the state treasurer's office, so that if the money runs short, we don't take a huge bath, and if the money does not run short, then they get the money back with interest. We also would hope that you would advise that the Decommissioning Trust Fund be used for decommissioning, not as in Vermont, being spent for lobbying fees, for property taxes, for emergency planning, and this is all on record with the Attorney General of the state of Vermont. Last, we recommend that this panel make it more convenient for the public, town officials, to communicate with members of the panel so there would be established a method, if we email documents to the panel, that they in turn will be distributed to all members of the panel. Last, we recommend that the panel here amend the current legislation so that you will have funding which will enable you to have experts. Without experts, you will not be able to really constructively analyze issues as they come forward. This was the major recommendation by the head of the VCAP when she came to Plymouth, was the group needs funding. You cannot just rely on the representatives from various agencies or for volunteers to provide the expert research that you will need to properly make advice, and I thank you very much for the time.
Jim Lambert. Jim Lambert. Can we shut the projector off? Is that possible? The light. It's lovely.
I'm Jim Lambert, and I'm also a member of the Duxbury Nuclear Affairs Committee. First, I have three quick questions that came out of what Mr. Lynch's presentation was today, and I may have misunderstood or may simply have been choices of words. At one point on the slides said that Pilgrim will close no later than May 31, 2019. At another period of time, he referred to that as a projected closing date. So I guess my question, Mr. Lynch and Mr. Toomey, you may also be able to answer it. Are there any circumstances under which Pilgrim will not close by June 1st, 2019?
I'm not aware of any circumstance under which the plant would operate beyond May 31st, 2019.
Because that obviously did happen in New York.
It did not happen in New York. I'm not sure what you're talking about.
New York, they were going to close and they extended. It's happened on the energy-owned plants in upstate New York were scheduled to close, and that closing is not going to happen.
Well, we had not made the commitment we've made here to the ISO to shut down. So in this case, we've made that irrevocable commitment. It's a different situation in New England because of the forward capacity market that's in place. Well, I think what Joe was trying to get to is that it's a no later than date. There could be circumstances in which it's sooner than that.
That I understand.
But it will be no later than that date.
Thank you. A second, there was a reference that whether to use Safe Store had not been decided yet. We have been told in the past that Energy will use Safe Store. Is not decided yet? Does that mean it's no longer certain? Is there a change of circumstance that would lead to potentially not using Safe Store? Could you just explain?
The only time the company will declare the method by which it will decommission the plant is in the post-shutdown decommissioning activities report. That document has not been filed. I'm not aware of any statement made by anybody on behalf of Entergy that it will definitely be Safe Store for Pilgrim. But we won't make that declaration until we file the PSDAR, which is likely to be filed around the time of the shutdown. It could be filed as late as 2 years after the shutdown.
I understand. And that will be prepared by TLG?
The PSDAR is submitted by Entergy. A component of the PSDAR is a site-specific decommissioning cost estimate on which we will rely on TLG to help us develop that cost estimate. They're an expert, a national expert firm that's affiliated with us that has the information that we need.
affiliated, my understanding is they're a wholly owned subsidiary of Entergy Corporation. Is that correct?
They are subsidiary, that's correct.
And that actually leads to the question of costs. And we've heard about the $100 billion that is there. And what I've been able to find in public documents is that you can find some reports that were filed. I believe they're actually prepared by TLG as cost estimates back in 2008, that for both Vermont Yankees and Pilgrim's expected decommissioning cost. The number for Pilgrim 9 years ago was $914 million. The the Vermont Yankee, if you compare what was estimated in 2008 and what was estimated in the PSDR filed simultaneously with closing in 2014, went up about 50%. There are industry studies that say the costs of decommissioning are going up between 08 and 15 at 60%. Well, 60% added to 914 comes to very, very close to $1.5 billion, which is substantially more than is in that decommissioning fund right now. And those numbers, they're easy to back up just where they came from. Obviously, Entergy has not given me any more recent reports that it may have on the cost of growing Pilgrim, but that's what you can find in the public records. Finally, I'd just like to expand slightly on what my wife indicated on public participation. There are a lot of us here who are very much interested in working with this panel, to listen to what you have to say and, frankly, to provide you with information. It would be extremely helpful to us if this panel had a website on which all of your documents that you had received or sent out are posted so we can get access to them. It would also, just going a little farther, be extremely helpful if you would post the email addresses. I'm not going to ask for telephone numbers because nobody wants to pick up my call, of the various members of the panel who are sitting here so that we can communicate. Because absent full communication between both this side of the podium and yours, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult for us to understand what the panel's concerns are, what it wants to accomplish, and for you to understand what ours are. Thank you.
Thank you. Sandra Hammond.
Good evening. My name is Sandra Hammond. I'm a resident of Plymouth and a registered voter. I'm also the music director at a local church. My father is an elected member of town meeting. He's 84 years old. And my parents live within 5 miles of Pilgrim. They're the only parents I will ever have. And there are many ways that they could pass away in old age. I cannot protect them from those. But what I can do is express my concern about an incredibly dangerous facility less than 5 miles from their home. Mr. Toomey, I also agree that polarizing and demonizing each other is not valuable. We could make this like a movie, like a large evil coalition and angry hippie activists like me, and that doesn't really help anybody. So like me, you're probably active in your local community. Like me, you have friends and family that you care about. All of you on this commission are volunteering your time, and you have to come together in this forum 4 times a year. My concern is personal. So I know that it may have been upsetting when Ms. Dubois spoke with a lot of emotion, but for me, there is a lot at stake. There is a reason to have a lot of emotion. Do I have neighbors that work at Pilgrim? Sure. Do I blame them? No, it's a job. I have a job too. But I do think that she represents what I believe are bipartisan concerns, Democrats or Republicans in the room, who live in the area, and I think Representative Muratori may have just left. Oh, there he is, thank you. He has children who live in this zip code too, and I think any kind of nuclear accident would surely upset him, and he wants his kids to live a long life as well. So I want to thank him for his legislation putting forward the Entergy, which is the largest financial power in the room put forth more funding. And so that, to someone like me, that can be intimidating. You're a nice man, I'm not angry at you, but I am very scared about the power that such a large corporation has to threaten the safety of the only family I will ever have. Thank you.
Thank you. Diane Price? Diane Price.
Diana Price, Plymouth resident. Let's see, there was some talk about the dry cask storage and, oh, sorry. Here we go. Diana Price, Plymouth resident. There was some talk about the dry cask storage, and I'm very concerned about the choices now that we're making and how they may ultimately limit our ability to remove the nuclear waste or make it so it's so financially difficult that it doesn't get removed. And then this method, he talked about the Holtec 100 method or system to remove waste by boat, rail, and truck. Does anybody know if this system has actually been used anywhere, or is it just workable in theory? Anybody? Maybe? Navy has been used it?
The Navy right now ships their spent fuel from their fleet presently.
Okay.
So
And they're using that system to ship it?
I don't know exactly the system they're using, if it's the Holtec 100, but they're taking it from the ships to the cask that will transfer the spent fuel.
Okay, yeah, I'm just very concerned that whatever decisions that we're making now and we're putting things into dry cask storage limits the ultimate transportability and will ultimately end up with Plymouth being a long-term nuclear waste dump, essentially. So I just would like it if everybody took that into consideration, and if there was some way to if there's a smaller size cask, if there's something else that has not been considered, I would like it if people would take that into consideration. Thank you.
Jamil Graham? Jamil Graham? I might be butchering the name.
Hi, I'm Jamil Graham. I'm going to stand back because I want to see you all. Hi. I'm a concerned global citizen, and I'm a resident of Boston, Massachusetts. And I'm very grateful we're here. My concern is, of course, everybody's who's expressed as well. I would like to bring in the legacy of the nuclear industry. So we have had 60 plus years of the nuclear industry who has shown us time and again their practices and their policies. Right now, in this moment, we are living with the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant that is currently has 3 nuclear power plants in meltdown that have not been addressed, that are spewing nuclear radionuclides into the environment, unchecked for 6 years and counting. We have on this continent, Hanford Nuclear Repository, which is what it's become, which is our very first nuclear reactor site, as many probably are very well versed. It now has approximately 177 sites where nuclear waste is being stored, transported, buried in tanks that are now very well documented and leaking. We have decommissioning questions going on around the globe, and we also have a situation happening in Europe, in Spain, in Garoña, the Garoña nuclear central plant that was actually closed for 4 years. Very much like Pilgrim, an operation for its full 40-year license, it closed. And now, right now, at this moment, they are trying to reopen it with much consternation in the community. Now, I hold all these together in the same light as this decommissioning conversation because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, whether it speaks Spanish or Japanese or any other language, has shown to us its disregard for the actual radionuclide contamination that it's projecting and continuing to allow to take over the planet, literally. The radionuclides, among many things, are known to affect the genetic compound of every living species. So in effect, at this point, we are terraforming life on this planet by allowing radionuclides to be spewing around the globe. And I'm very concerned for our children, but I am very faithful because I know that we have intelligence. We have intelligence to register and measure the electromagnetic waves between galaxies. We have this incredible intelligence to visit Mars and endure incredible electromagnetic atmospheres. So I know we have the technology. I know we have the love for our planet and for our species and for all of us somewhere, okay? I don't know that we'll ever agree, but I would really like to be part of this conversation evolving from right and wrong to a place of mutual respect. Thank you.
Thank you. Henrietta Cosentino.
I've heard so many wonderful questions and comments that I'm humbled, and I just want to thank all of you. First of all, thanks to the panel for spending a lot of time and taking your jobs so seriously. If our comments seem to you ad hominem, this is for the people from Entergy, please understand, as several have put it already eloquently, that it's not ad hominem. It's simply that we are traumatized. We're a traumatized community living with a horrific reality, which is that we are now, for the foreseeable future, a nuclear waste dump. And there are 5 million people living within a 50-mile radius of Pilgrim, so that it does affect Boston. It does affect not just the Cape, but all the way up to Maine and down to Maryland. It's a very serious situation, so please understand it's never ad hominem, and the lady who just spoke from Boston really put it so eloquently. We need to come to a place where we are human beings trying to solve a very problematic situation and to go forward. I'd like one other small comment, which is to affirm the concern that Pine Dubois expressed, because it does go to the heart of the matter. I cannot say too emphatically how important it is for this panel to consider that question, that specific question, the location, the siting of the dry cask storage, because as you must be aware, the latest NOAA estimate for coastal flooding tells us that it's almost certain that we'll have at least 6 feet higher seas in the before the end of the century, and there's a possibility of 10 to 12 feet of high water higher than there is now. This really does call into question the safety of the dry cask storages. Also, it's my understanding that dry casks start to degrade after 30 years or sooner. So what is to be done about that? Where is any guarantee that even before the end of this century we won't be dealing with irredeemable leakage? This is something that we need this panel to be very concerned with. So I could say a lot more, but I think most people have said everything that I was concerned about. And I just wish you courage and fortitude in your jobs, and please make it possible for the public to interact with you, because nothing could be more important. It really is, it's one of the keys to the success of the decommissioning. If you do not consider the public concerns fully, then you will have failed in your advisory capacity. I had one other point and it suddenly escaped me. It'll come to me next meeting. I can't think of it. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. I really can't read the next name. Is it Nan? Any idea what that says? Langdon? Okay. Shirley Lynch? Shirley is a nice name, but my name is Sheila Lynch Benton, and that's all right. Duxbury. I'm a private resident. I'm just here for the information, but I'm alarmed by Mr. Lynch's not a relative presentation about Safe Store versus Decon. Decon, as I understand, is a 60-year process where, no, Safe Store is immediate. Oh, I'm sorry. Safe Store is a 60-year process. Decon puts it off till later. Decontaminate right away. He mentioned that Vermont needed $1.24 billion and that Plymouth current fund is $1 billion. So clearly we're underfunded to start with. And my concern is that Entergy will then put off decontaminating the plant because of lack of funding. And he mentioned in his presentation that funding would prohibit any closure from going forward unless there was adequate funding. So there's an issue about the amount of funds available and the 2-year process left with closure.
No, if I can, I'd
Sure.
like to try to clarify a couple things. There are 2 decommissioning methods, decon and safe store. Decon is referred to as prompt decommissioning. It doesn't mean immediate decommissioning because you need to have some time for the spent fuel to cool after the plant is shut down. But it would be relatively soon after the shutdown if you opted for that method, maybe 3 to 5 years or so after shutdown. That's the earliest you could do it. Safe Store is simply deferred decommissioning, and it doesn't have to be for 60 years. What the NRC requires is that the licensee complete decommission the plant within 60 years. But the Safe Store period could be 5 years, it could be 15 years.
And the Safe Store is dry cask, decon
No,
is...
Safe Store simply means, if you think about it this way, it's really decon and Safe Store are versions of the same thing. Decon just means that you're decommissioning the site. Safe Store means you're deferring that major work for some period of time. Could be 5 years, could be 10 years, could be 20.
Due to funding?
Well, it can be due to funding, but you are just deferring the work, and it doesn't have to be up to 60 years. The selection of which method, whether it's decon or Safe Store, has no impact whatsoever on the shutdown date for the facility. The facility will shut down on or about June 1st, 2019, regardless of the trust fund balance or anything else.
I understand the site will shut down no matter what by May 31st, 2019. But whether it's properly, safely stored, currently we have $1 billion for decommissioning, but Vermont needed $1.24 billion, and yet Plymouth might be larger. But, so we don't have enough money.
What you said was that there were inadequate funds for it to be properly and safely stored, and I don't agree with that.
It's a matter of an opinion.
Well, the fact is that we will either start decommissioning approximately 5 years after shutdown, when the fuel is cool and out of the spent fuel pool, or it will be decommissioned at some point thereafter. It could be 5 years later than that, it could be 10 years later, it could be 15 years later, but the Nuclear Regulatory Commission requires that it be complete within 60 years unless you file for and obtain some kind of an extension.
So, to my point, he mentioned the decision whether it's decon or safe store will be a cost-benefit analysis, which will be an economic analysis of which way to go. And I would like to add to the cost-benefit analysis of Pilgrim is that it's different than the other decommissioned sites in upstate New York, Vermont, Yankee Row, in that it's in an international flight zone from Logan Airport in terms of its cost-benefit, terrorism issues, etc. It's totally different than the other sites in New England. And also the population in the area was mentioned earlier, but also the cultural heritage. Chernobyl has an 18-kilometer zone, 30-mile zone around it that cannot be entered by humans for 20,000 years is the current estimate when people can return back to the Chernobyl area. So in the cost-benefit analysis of how to decommission Pilgrim, I'd like the commission to consider the 18 miles around Pilgrim Nuclear Power Plant being out of commission for 20,000 years for humans if there's an accident. I think it's significant that this plant is in a major flight path, that it is currently has an open pool with open storage, and that the current standard of dry cask is 4 feet above sea level, 150 feet in from Cape Cod Bay, and people are talking about endangered whales and all the rest. I really think it's important, the 30-mile zone of people in this area and the amount of population, the cultural resources in this area, and that this commission really consider Pilgrim as special above rural nuclear power plants that have been decommissioned. This is extremely important that you really consider the flight path and the cost-benefit analysis of an accident in this zone. Thank you. We've gone over the public comment period, but there is one more person that is on the list, so I'd like to, if they could keep their comments very brief so that we can wrap up and be done by 8 o'clock. Bruce Taub. If you could, we do need to wrap up with next steps.
I'm a good attorney.
I'm sure you are. There's a handheld mic there. If you could use that, that would be helpful.
First of all, congratulations on your appointment to this committee and on the awesome responsibilities that you have been given. I'd like to contextualize your work for you, if I may, from my perspective as an attorney with interest in state and federal regulations of energy and energy-producing facilities. I remind you that, for example, the statute that creates this body exists within an act to promote energy diversity. So it's being seen in the context of energy as a whole, and then your powers are dramatically limited are dramatically limited.
I misspoke. We do have another speaker, so that would...
You're in an advisory capacity only. That's number one. You're to commence public meetings. You're to hold a minimum of 4 public meetings, although empowered to do more, and so I would request, at least initially, that absolutely every meeting be publicized, be opened, be recorded. I trust that that will happen. To advise on issues, to serve as a conduit for public information related to the decommissioning funds, and to receive reports relative to Ms. Lambert's comment about the reports being seen. I hope that everybody on the panel and everybody in the Commonwealth will be educated in this process. We are decommissioning what nobody can deny is a potentially dangerous, tragically dangerous facility with very special concerns relative to the long life of nuclear waste and the proximity to the ocean. So with those comments, I leave you to your good work. Thank you.
Thank you. I do want to give Ken Tavares, I apologize. If you're here, I almost overlooked you. If you could do your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. On behalf of the Board of Selectmen from Plymouth, we appreciate all of you serving on this panel. When we made our appointments, we looked for diversity, and when our council was sought on other appointments, we asked for the same thing. So we are certainly looking for good things, to come from you. We also want to say to you, ask the tough questions and seek the truthful answers. I have learned, and I think my colleagues on the board would agree, that this is a very complex process. And over the years, and going back to the beginning of this plan, we always felt somewhat that we weren't in touch, that the decisions are made on much higher levels. Well, that happened all during the life of a plant, but now we're looking to decommission, and we're still in that same position. Your work is going to set the table for what happens on the federal level. And again, I repeat, you have to ask the tough questions. There's an economic component to this, and there's a safety component to it. We are depending on you. We have to have the engagement of the Commonwealth if we're going to get the federal government to change some of its ways. I thank you for being here. I'm sure you're going to have more than 4 meetings, and I wish you well, and you have the full support of the town of Plymouth. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. I finally here look at next steps. We will, as our lawyer friend discussed, we will be posting these meetings pursuant to Chapter 188 of the Acts of 216. So we were, I'm not sure if I quoted that right statute, but we will, we will be publishing the next meeting. I think what we did hear loud and clear, the necessity, and I know Mr. Lynch mentioned it, of a website, because the goal, obviously, one of the a primary goal of this group is to make sure that the public has access and transparency to all the information. Well, we need to establish a website.
I would really like to see EEA sponsor the website.
We can talk about that. We can talk about that. But there will be a website. I know Mr. Lynch doing what they did in Vermont, that they hosted that website. But we can look at what the options are for hosting a website, and we will publish the date of the next meeting. And if there are other questions or general business of this commission right now, it's to be addressed to Matthew Campbell. He's on his email address is on the agenda that was in the front when people signed in. So, are there other questions or comments?
Sean Mullen. I'd like to make the first motion of the evening, and that motion is that we decide right now to hold more than quarterly meetings. I think secondly, there clearly is a need among the board to go back and take a look at the legislation, whether it's about the website where it's clearly delineated and specified in the legislation that the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs shall provide the administrative support to this. Tonight, it also said in the legislation that one of the first administrative duties was to select by the board, not by the legislation, but by the board, the chair or co-chairs of the committee. We have a lot of administrative organizational things to do as a group to figure out exactly how we're going to try to provide the best advice, how to get the best input over the next months and years to come. So I'd like to make a motion right now that approximately a month, 5 weeks, whatever's convenient can be arranged, that the next meeting of the board or the panel is conducted at a location in Plymouth again, because I think it's more convenient for most of the stakeholders and most of the people involved, and that meeting, the agenda be developed by input from each of the panel members, and these things we've heard from the community tonight, and that agenda first focuses on allowing us an opportunity to get this thing organized with subcommittees and groups and really delineating what we need to begin looking at. So that's my motion. I'm looking for a second.
Pat Charamello with the Old Colony Planning Council. I'd be happy to second that.
Well, I really think we need to table that for this meeting, as I said on the outset. We can discuss that, and I'm happy to discuss that with panel members, but I want to table that decision for this meeting, as I mentioned when we opened it up, for now. Yes. Oh, no, we're not. We are committed to 4 meetings by the legislation. I'm not saying we're not doing 4 meetings. I'm talking about administrative support and who hosts the website and that information. We are committed to 4 meetings by the legislation, and I believe I can speak for the commission to say that we will have 4 meetings.
Just real quickly in closing, given that I was one of the legislators while I was in that actually sponsored and wrote the legislation, I want to be real clear about something. The concern I have, and just as background, I also serve as the accountable executive for an airline that flies 140,000 flights a year, and just for the purposes of sort of display, I have with me our 170-page safety management system program. And one of the reasons that we did this, being mindful of preemption and what jurisdiction we have as a state, as a commonwealth, is my extreme discomfort relative to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and its ability. And this is not a slight. It sounds like it's a slight on industry. It isn't. I'm a CEO. I'm an executive of a corporation that depends on safety for our survival. But I also have a very good respect and understanding of the role of government in making sure that safety is adhered to. The safety systems that the airline industry has in place relative to feedback loops, relative to oversight, relative to internal audits, is, by comparison, it doesn't even compare with what the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the NRC do relative to this industry. And I think it is paramount, and it's one of the reasons that we filed the legislation, that we understand first and foremost that through the decommissioning process, and there have only been a handful of these plants decommissioned, so we don't have a lot of prior cases to learn from, that we make sure there are safety systems in place that will guarantee that that is put in front of any economic or financial considerations, and that there be adequate public input, and from the Commonwealth, the ability to input to the NRC. They don't have to listen to us. I understand preemption. The state has no more ability to weigh in at an airline than we do at a power plant that's a nuclear power plant. I get all that. But you're hearing from an expert right now, not a legislative expert. I only did that 6 years. I've been flying airplanes for 40 years and running an airline for 28. And I am concerned about the lack of safety system management as it relates to the decommissioning of this plant. Specifically to the decommissioning. So I'm not even talking about the operating of the power plant now. I'm talking specifically about systems that need to be in place to make sure that as this plant is taken apart and we transfer fuel and ultimately, hopefully, export the fuel, that it's done in a safe manner. And I have seen nothing that gives my mind ease and peace relative to those systems being in place. This is not intent. This is system management. And I really think this group needs to focus on that. Thank you.
Could I make a motion? I would like to simplify Mr. Mullins' motion and just ask this board to set the next date for our meeting 1 month, 4 weeks from tonight at June 21st.
There's certain citing requirements that we have to notify the Secretary of State. It has to go through a whole process. So we can't pick a date tonight. We are committed, everybody up here is committed to the 4 meetings. So we will be scheduling another meeting. I can't give you a date right now because there's a whole process that we have to go through before we can set that date.
Let me just point out, Madam Chairman, are you ruling a motion to hold a meeting as soon as possible out of order? Is that what you're saying?
There's a process in setting these meetings. I can't sit here tonight and pick a date without understanding all of the aspects that we had to go through to set this meeting, with public postings and notification through the Secretary of State's office. So
I'd like to make a suggestion, Sean, if I can, on your attempt here, that we ask the chair to set a meeting as early as 1 month from tonight, as soon as she can. As soon as she can. That's all. You can promise us that you'll do it as soon as bureaucratically possible.
I would certainly accept that amendment.
again, I'm not an expert in how we have to post these public meetings. I chair an agency and was put in this spot by the legislature, thank you. But I don't know exactly the soonest date that we can do that, but we will look at that date and send out that notice as soon as practicable.
One last point, Madam Chairman. Since you read what the advisory board's role shall be under Section 14, I'd like to point out that under Section D, the panel annually shall elect a chair or co-chairs and a vice chair for a one-year term commencing with its first meeting. Follow the effective date of
And I
this
suggested that we would table that election until the next meeting, which is my right, I believe, as chair to do. I am motion to adjourn. Carries. Thank you.